Hello and welcome to the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. In this episode, I'll be discussing aphids and BYDV control with Tillage Specialist Ciaran Collins. And I first asked Ciaran, how are spring cereals looking at the moment?
What looked like was going to be a very late spring at one stage actually turned out to be absolutely fine. You know, we did get that dry spell in early April. Seed beds have been excellent and establishment percentages are really, really good. So most spring cereals now are emerging, say, in early April or the last of them are up at this stage.
So we want to try and concentrate maybe in this podcast looking at some of the main pests of spring cereals. Aphids obviously one of the main threats, but more specifically they spread Barley Yellow Dwarf Virus, or BYDV as people might know it as. How much of a threat is BYDV to crops, Ciaran? And what sort of aphids are spreading the BYDV?
Yeah, I suppose, like you said, Michael, BYDV is a major challenge in recent years, but it's the grain aphid in Ireland that we're mainly concerned with in terms of spread of it being the main vector for BYDV. But I suppose it's always important to remember there are other aphid species out there, like the bird cherry aphid, which would be the primary vector in the UK, you know. And I suppose potentially maybe the bird cherry aphid might be more of an issue as temperatures increase and our winters become milder. But at the moment, really, it would be the grain aphid that we'd be concerned with. In terms of the risks, I suppose, look, the risks are to all spring cereals, really. But I think really the later sown crops are always where the risk is higher. And, you know, Teagasc trials in the past have actually found yield losses of up to 2 tons per hectare in late April emerging barley crops. So, you know, I suppose it also is important to remember as well, this isn't all about barley. It's about, you know, all spring cereals, oats and wheat as well, you know.
And they're all equally at risk. So with aphids, is there many of them out there at the moment?
I suppose in terms of aphid counts, I suppose the main thing that we'd be looking at the moment, and I suppose more so into the future, is suction towers. So there's a suction tower in operation in Oak Park at the moment. Now, I suppose indications at the moment would be that the numbers are lowish, but I suppose being a new process, a lot of this is just being validated at the moment. So we'll need a little bit more time, I suppose, to ensure its accuracy. But I suppose when you're walking crops, it's not hard to find them, especially where I am down the south. You know, you will find aphids. But I think, you know, an awful lot of that depends on location, field history, and history of BYDV in the area as well.
In the past, growers would have, I suppose, looked to Oak Park or looked to some of the counts that Teagasc would have come up with, of which we had over the years. You mentioned suction traps. We're now moved to those. How is that going to be different in terms of the numbers in comparison to what we were given before?
Well, I suppose the main advantage of the suction traps, and I suppose anybody that follows the AHDB and they use a lot of them in the UK, is that they cover a wide radius of up to 50 kilometres. So they're 12.2 metres high. It's literally an upside down Hoover. And it's catching everything that flies at that level. So I suppose ultimately, you know, over time, you have to open them up, identify what's there, and I suppose they have a huge role to play in research in identifying the number of aphids there, but also the level of virus that those aphids are carrying as well.
Okay, we might come back to that maybe towards the end of the podcast to get maybe a little bit more insight into that. But if we're to bring it back now to a farmer and a farmer's field, how or what sort of process should a farmer go through to decide whether he should be applying an aphicide or controlling those aphids this year?
Yeah, I suppose the first thing which I think is important to remember is, you know, locations vary, and even within a location, fields will vary, you know. So I think the main process that we should go through is an integrated pest management process. And the key one and the first one that you're looking at is sowing date. We know from research that, you know, February and March sown crops are much lower risk than April sown crops. As I said earlier on, the late April sown crops, you know, as aphid numbers increase can suffer hugely from BYDV. And as I said as well previously, location is a big factor as well. You know, milder locations, particularly more southerly and coastal, would be very important. And I suppose another very important factor in relation to, you know, assessing this risk that you may or may not have would be ask the question, was there a green bridge from the previous crop? So, you know, if there are a high level of volunteers from last year's crop into this year's crop before the field was ploughed, that also increase your risks, as does mild winters, we'll say. But ultimately, if I'm trying to make a decision at the moment whether you need to use an insecticide or not, I suppose you need to get out into the field and walk the crop, and are they visible in the crop? And if you can see aphids in the crop, well, I suppose that's really the big telltale sign, really, Michael.
Ciaran, if a farmer finds an aphid in the field, how does he know that's the correct one he needs to control?
Yeah, it's very difficult. I mean, okay, the grain aphid has long black stefunculi on the abdomen, but that's very difficult to see in the field. And as you say, there's a range of species in most fields, but getting out and walking the field, you will find aphids, and I suppose you can assume that there's a mixture of aphid species within the field. So I suppose that's going to give you a good indicator. Sometimes, if you walk field later in the evening, when the sunlight is on the leaves, you can actually see them a little bit easier. But I think just actually getting out into the field and having a look around is probably the main thing.
So I suppose if the general principle that if the weather is good enough, aphid numbers, no matter what species is out there, they're probably all going to increase at a reasonable rate the warmer it is.
Absolutely, especially as we move, into late April and obviously into May.
Okay, so we also know that from research coming out from Oak Park and obviously from maybe the UK as well, we know there's resistance or aphids are resistant to some of the aphicides that we're applying to them. How serious is this in Ireland?
I suppose it's pretty serious in the sense that, like, knockdown resistance, or KDR, was first detected in 2013. So effectively, aphids with KDR, with this gene, they're less susceptible to pyrethroid. So pyrethroid is, a Sumi Alpha, Karate, Ninja, Desis, Protec, any of those products, they're all pyrethroids. And to date, the KDR has only been identified in the grain aphid, and as I said earlier on, that appears to be most important vector of Barley Yellow Dwarf Virus. But even within the grain aphid, it's actually just a single clone called SA3, so that's the one that's most commonly associated. But I suppose in more practical terms, like, the research does indicate that aphids carrying this resistant gene are present in all major grain growing areas in Ireland. And I suppose importantly as well, we've also discovered that there is a second resistance mechanism in the Irish population. This is where aphids exhibit a metabolic resistance, so they effectively have an ability to detoxify the insecticide. So like I said, look, it's the incidence and frequency of KDR varies annually, but it's in all the major grain growing areas. But our estimate would be from research carried out by Dr. Lael Welsh that it would be probably less than 50% based on random sampling that was done in 16, 17 and 18.
So how will a farmer know if he has a resistant population on his farm?
Well, I suppose really it's doing everything right, in the sense of, applying the insecticide at the right stage, which is the 3 to 4 leaf stage, and it's really getting into the field after application and assuming that you've done everything right, in that you had your boom height in the sprayer, everything correct, the correct application rate, and again getting out into the field and investigating, are there live aphids in the field? And I suppose, that's probably going to be your best indicator whether you've had a control failure or not. It's also important to say as well, there is no point in repeating the exercise if you've done everything correctly the first time.
Obviously, aphids, some of them have wings, more of them don't. Maybe some of the aphids might have flown in afterwards. Which types, or what ones should you be looking at in terms of the ones left behind, if you like?
Well, certainly you're going to get a certain repellent activity from the aphicides at the early stages after application. So that will normally, sometimes if it's working well, will repel aphids coming into the field, but you'll all see the little juveniles in the field as well. And they're probably much easier to find when you're examining the crop afterwards. I should also say as well, Michael, there's something that's interesting, and people might observe it in the field, is that there seems to be a fitness penalty associated with resistance as well, in that these aphids appear to have a reduced response to alarm pheromones, and they're more susceptible to predation from natural enemies. So you might see some mummified aphids in the field as well.
Jesus, the first bit of good news, Ciaran. That's great. Nature's working with us. Try to work with it as best we can. Okay, so
very important.
The range of insecticides obviously out there is not huge, and obviously where guys can avoid using them, they should do so. But with the choices there, is there much choice there, I suppose, for farmers?
Unfortunately not, no. I mean, we're pretty much restricted to pyrethroids only, which would be the, as I said earlier, the karates, ninjas, sumi alphas, and those really. So I suppose it's very important that, we mind them and that they're targeted, So like I said earlier on, March sown crops would be low risk. April, you're certainly early April, medium risk, and the risk gets much higher as you move into the month really. So I think, in terms of minding the pyrethroids, it's about using them at the correct stage, which is the 4-leaf stage. But even at that, there's still likely to be a significant number of aphids moving into the crop, but the primary goal here really is not to eliminate all the aphids in the crop, but it's to reduce the population at that critical time when the crop is particularly vulnerable really. And I suppose also it's worth mentioning as well that I say that 4-leaf timing in Teagasc trials, we found that 2 applications, let's say the 2 and 4-leaf stage or 4-leaf stage and first node, there weren't any significant difference to 1 application at that 4-leaf stage.
There's been a lot of research completed by Teagasc around aphid control. What can we expect from Teagasc in the near future?
I suppose in relation to what's going on in Teagasc, really, I suppose anybody that was at the open day in last year would have seen the ecological focus areas, and there's a level of biocontrol going on there, looking at the promotion of natural enemies to see what effect they can have. There's also a number of experiments going on in relation to degree days experiments again, which will be due out soon. And I suppose very important at the moment, there's one Welsh fellow scholar looking at the genome of the grain aphid. So that's something that hasn't been done before. And also there's research going on in relation to how BYDV virus is transmitted into plants and the interaction between the virus and the aphid and the plant. And again, there's another student who's studying the bird cherry aphid, which I mentioned earlier on, because while our concentration up to now has mainly been on the grain aphid, but as we see in the UK, the bird cherry aphid is an important vector there as well. So it is important to look at that. But I think all of this is sort of underpinned with the suction towers. There's one in Oak Park at the moment, and there's plans for one in the northeast and the south as well. And they'll cover, a 50-kilometer radius, which will cover really all of the main grain growing areas. And I suppose they're a vital tool really in terms of the research going forward.
Okay, and the identification of aphids, and I suppose more importantly, identification of virus carrying aphids is probably the important part coming out of those suction towers, I suppose.
Yeah, virus, the species of aphids, obviously number one, and the type and the virus, and whether or not they're carrying virus, I suppose, is the critical element for us on the ground.
Okay, Ciaran, look, that's a brilliant summation, I think, of the aphid control and BYDV. Thanks very much for your time, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Michael.
That's it for the Tillage Edge this week, and my thanks to Ciaran Collins for joining me on the podcast. Don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcast or Spotify so you never miss a show. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy, and thanks for listening. And I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.